I think I was always writing. I don't think there was any point of time when I wasn't writing and wasn't a writer. But I think there's a difference between writing and then thinking of yourself as a writer. And I think that thinking of myself only happened after my very first book was published by a small press in the US. And so that was in 2000. And after I'd written the first draft of Babyji, that's when I said, okay, now I really have, well, seems to be the second book. And so now I think I can't escape the fact that I'm a writer. But I remember already writing when I was about 7. And I wrote a novel when I was 13 and a half, 14 years old in the summer vacation on a typewriter. That's the only time I've written on a typewriter. And then I wrote another one when I was 19. And they were both terrible. But I think they were important to get out of the way. And I was also writing non-fiction, not just fiction. I wrote essays and I wrote for the school magazine and so forth. I think I always had a sense of my voice as a writer from actually quite early on. I think what had changed was in terms of thinking of what I was doing in my life, and also the knowledge that this meant, at that point I quit. I used to have a full-time job and I quit it in order to completely finish and be happy with my manuscript for Babyji. So I think what had changed is sort of my relationship with the world and how I perceive myself in it. But with regards to my own writing, no. I think I had a voice, and I've always been interested in new things as a writer, so I sort of keep changing and experimenting with other forms. But the voice is something different. I don't know. I don't think I come up with a definition of what my voice as a writer is, but I know it, and I think that's the one thing that doesn't change. I don't have a sense of my audience as a writer, and sometimes, the publishing industry wants you to think about that, and I really have a hard time. I really don't know who I'm writing for. And I've been very pleasantly surprised with each of my books as to who they have been written for, because readers find your books and then sometimes they write you back. And I'm always surprised that a certain book that I thought would appeal to a certain category of people also appeals to other people. Or so that's humbling, and that's good actually, because it tells me that I shouldn't worry too much about who I'm really writing for. And of course, I think primarily I'm writing for myself. Babyji is about the 16-year-old girl who's coming of age in Delhi at a very particular time. And that time is particular because there are certain political upheavals in the city at that time and in the country, but Delhi was the city the most affected by it. And a lot of students burnt themselves in the protests at that time. But there was also something else interesting about that period, which was that the economy was just opening up in India. So we went from a regulated economy to a free market economy, and simultaneously we went from having just sort of one television channel that was run by the state to having all of America's television, all of America's soap operas in our living rooms. And so the culture began to change really rapidly. So it was a transition point, and I thought that was that particular period was very interesting because all kinds of things happened because of the changes. And so this character became possible. And this character, though she's 16, she's sort of she's coming of age, physically beginning to understand herself, and has affairs with multiple people. And the politics of what's happening outside, which is based on caste, also enters her own personal relationships. So they are all sort of interwoven. And at the end of the day, she's also, most importantly, asking herself what she really wants to be in life and who she really is. And that's connected with her understanding of her country and what it's going through at that point. I wrote without censoring myself, but I wasn't, and I wrote as it came to me naturally, but I wasn't really thinking of posing a challenge. And I knew that it would be provocative. But there's a difference between knowing it and then going and seeking to do it. So it happened, and I knew what the result would be, and I had to live with that consequence. But there wasn't, I wasn't searching to be provocative with it. And the other thing is that when I started the book, what I really knew I was going to do was have that particular period of Indian history as the backdrop of the novel, which is the late 80s, early 90s. I didn't know too much else. And then I started writing this character, and she really took off. And at certain points, I mean, I had trouble reining her in. And then I would say, oh no, she's gone and done something else now. How do I bring this back and sort of keep it together? And I think a lot of what is provocative comes from her activities and actions, though the politics is also quite, it's a volatile thing in the memory of people who live in Delhi, because we were all affected by it, my generation. No, it wasn't. And I think that was interesting. And what was also telling was that before that, actually, I had another book come out in India, my first novel, which was also published by the same publishers, Penguin, which is extremely explicit and sexual, and in the voice of a gay male character. And I thought they might want to censor some of it, and they didn't. And the only censorship they suggested was actually a passage about India in Babyji, which has to do with the country. Which I was absolutely committed to, and which was not censored and appeared in its full form. But I thought that was very telling, that political sort of aspect of the book was what was really going to be the difficult thing to digest. But I think a lot of the people, a lot of my readers in India are on the younger side, which isn't saying that much, because half the population of the country is under the age of 25. So a lot of them have lived through and can relate to her personal experiences. And everybody who is my generation can relate to what happened at that time politically, because we sort of lived through it. You know, schools were closed for a month, and there was high security everywhere, and people were out on the streets. So it's something that everybody lived through from their own perspective, but various perspectives are sort of represented in the book. So I think readers immediately connected to those aspects. And then the secrecy. I mean, this girl is doing all sorts of things that adults do, but her family doesn't know, her parents don't know, and I think that is a very widespread sort of experience in India for the younger generation. Less so now than in the time period that it's set, because the culture has opened up a lot, mostly because of foreign television and so on coming into the country. But I think the fact that people could connect to it, the younger generation could connect to it, sort of meant that it was really received quite well. And I think quite well understood. I think the only difference between the reception elsewhere is that people don't really know the politics, so they have to rely on what's explained in the book, which is fairly limited. It isn't a political dissertation, and the Indian audience is obviously much more familiar with the nuances of how the whole thing worked, which is not easily explained in a novel. I think it's part of my identity as a person, and so it seeps into my writing, but not all of my books have been set in India or about India, and or deal with it, yet it remains a big source of inspiration for me. And the fact that I grew up there and I lived there till I was 17 means that it's inside me, so sort of keeps coming out. But on the other hand, as a writer, I feel that I ought to and do assert my freedom to be able to write about other things and other places. I do visual art, both photography and painting and drawing, but I do them in spurts. They're not sort of always present, which somehow writing is, but they're also refreshing and liberating in a different way, because a novel is a very long project, and sometimes you can't see the end of it when you're writing it, and you have terrible days, you have good days, but you can't really see the result for a very, very long time, and it demands a certain kind of patience. And so in the way that I've approached the other things that I do, there's usually an immediate satisfaction involved. So I do something, and it's short term, and it gets done, and it requires a burst of energy. But then there's also the satisfaction of being able to see it and enjoy it sort of right away without having to wait for years. Yeah. And it's a certain kind of ventilation that I need, because I think I'm a very cerebral person who lives through words, and somehow the visual world, when I'm able to sort of enter it and do something in it really takes me away from having to be in the other side of my head. I don't map things out, though increasingly I've tried to, because when I don't map things out, the writing goes great, but then the editing becomes very challenging. At some point, I'm left with this really messy architecture that I have to somehow put back, and if the project is big, then it turns into a nightmare. So I try to map it out, but I've noticed that there's some writing self inside there that doesn't like it and sort of goes in the way in which it wants to go. But what I think is common to almost all of my endeavors is that it starts from a particular point. There's a certain thing that I want to do. So in Babyji, it was this particular time period in India that I wanted to write about, and in that summer in Paris, it was this old writer who's sort of facing his mortality that I wanted to write about, and that was clear, and then other things sort of become clear around it. So it's sort of really the impetus for the novel comes from a different place in each case, but I have a kernel, and then how it grows and what happens is sort of I try to control it, but it's very hard. I've always read very widely, and I've been going through a phase where I've been reading a lot of science, so not been reading many novels at all. That said, I think in the past, I would say 10 years, the authors I've read the most have been Philip Roth and John Coetzee.